August 9th, 1975, midnight, near the Ruacana-Kalweke line on the Cunane River. Ruacana-Kalweke wasn't just a river crossing. It was a strategic water and power lifeline for Southwest Africa. And defending the scheme became Pretoria's official public justification for moving forces in. The silence of the African bush is never truly empty. It is a dense tapestry of crickets, dry wind, and the low hiss of water flowing south. But tonight, that equilibrium is shattered. From the shadows of the Angolan shore, a convoy emerges. Bedford trucks with no license plates, no insignia, coated in a layer of reddish dust that camouflages their origin. As they ford the river, the headlights remain doused. The men jumping onto the sand do not look like soldiers of a modern, conventional army. They wear South African pattern camouflage, yet their uniforms have been crudely modified. Extra pockets sewn on, factory labels ripped out, any trace of official origin scrubbed away. They move with a lethal, rhythmic discipline. But when orders cut through the air, the language isn't the Afrikaans or English of Pretoria. It is a thick, rhythmic Portuguese, the accent of Luanda's backstreets and the jungles of northern Angola. To the outside world, these men do not exist. They are ghosts, armed with R1 rifles. While the international public fixed its gaze on apartheid inside South African cities, on mass arrests, bannings, and segregation, a military anomaly was being forged on the border of Southwest Africa, the territory South Africa then administered, now Namibia. The South African government needed to strike deep into Angola to blunt the advance of communism and protect its interests. But it could not afford the political fallout of an overt invasion. The solution began as a deniable experiment. Bravo Group, the nucleus that would become 32 Battalion. This is not merely the story of an elite unit. It is an investigation into plausible deniability. 32 Battalion was the scalpel of a shadow war, a tool designed so that the South African state could intervene in the Cold War's shifting chessboard without leaving a single fingerprint behind. Operational Order 8/75, signed on August 28, 1975, formalized support to the FNLA on paper, while Pretoria kept the real war off the record. They were the pariahs of a civil war not their own, a former enemies turned into the Praetorian Guard of an invisible frontier. Today, we dig through the archives to understand how a battalion that technically didn't exist became the most feared shock force on the continent. Who were these men fighting under a flag that refused to acknowledge them? And why did the support of UNITA's insurgency force Pretoria to construct one of the most elaborate denial systems of the era? The origin of 32 Battalion is not found in a traditional military academy, but in the chaotic vacuum left by a dying empire. In 1974, the Carnation Revolution in Lisbon signaled the abrupt end of Portuguese colonial rule in Angola. As the Portuguese withdrew, the country spiraled into a three-way civil war. By mid-1975, the MPLA was tightening its grip on Luanda with Soviet backing, and foreign military involvement was building fast. Cuba's large-scale combat deployment would come in late 1975. After Cuban advisors and instructors had already been on the ground, Operation Carlota ramped up in early November, and combat troops began flying into Luanda in the first half of November. To the south, Pretoria watched with growing alarm. They could not allow a communist stronghold on the border of Southwest Africa. This geopolitical panic set in motion the covert campaign that would become Operation Savannah, South Africa's first major intervention in the conflict. Amidst the retreating columns and burning outposts, thousands of fighters from the FNLA, National Liberation Front of Angola, were being decimated by their MPLA rivals. These men defeated, starving, and abandoned by their leaders, fled toward the southwest African border. They were soldiers without a country, facing certain execution if they stayed. Enter the architect, Colonel Jan Breitenbach. A veteran paratrooper and special forces officer, best known for founding 1 Reconnaissance Commando, Breitenbach saw something in these broken refugees that the high command in Pretoria had overlooked. While the SADF, South African Defence Force, was a traditionally white, conscript-based army, Breitenbach proposed a radical, almost heretical idea: recruit the enemy. In late August 1975, Pretoria authorized support and training for FNLA forces under Operational Order 8/75. Breitenbach moved fast, building what became Bravo Group, the nucleus of 32 Battalion, which under the wider effort later known as Operation Savannah. Breitenbach's logic was cold and pragmatic. These men were indigenous to the terrain, spoke the local languages, and most importantly, had nowhere else to go. By providing them with food, rifles, and a purpose, Pretoria didn't just gain soldiers, they gained expendable assets. Because they weren't South African citizens, their deaths wouldn't appear in the casualty lists that haunted white households back home. This created a unique hybrid identity. The unit, initially known as Bravo Group before becoming 32 Battalion, was a military anomaly. It consisted of black Angolan troops led by white South African, Rhodesian, and European mercenary officers. They operated in a moral and geographical no-man's land. In the eyes of the MPLA, they were traitors. In the eyes of the international community, they were mercenaries. And to the South African public, they simply didn't exist. They were a black unit fighting for a white supremacist state, a contradiction that forced them to forge a loyalty not to a country, but to each other and their buffalo insignia. To turn this ragtag group into the SADF's most lethal counterinsurgency force, Breitenbach implemented a brutal, unconventional training regime. They didn't just learn to shoot, they learned to disappear. The training focused on deep penetration operations, staying in the bush for weeks without resupply, living off the land, and mastering the art of the ambush. They were taught to fight like guerrillas, but with the discipline of a professional army. By the time they were officially designated as 32 Battalion, that they had become a terrifyingly efficient killing machine. They were the ghosts in the trees, the buffalo soldiers, who knew the Angolan bush better than the Cubans, and more intimately than the SADF regulars. The stage was set. The shadow war was about to begin. The first step was the strategic deployment along the border between Namibia and Angola, a 1,000-kilometer imaginary line of thorny scrub, suffocating heat, and treacherous rivers. But for 32 Battalion, the border was not a wall to be protected. It was a starting point. Their role was never static. They were a shock force designed for permanent offense. While regular SADF units handled logistics and base defense, the Buffaloes infiltrated deep into Angolan territory. They didn't just defend a line, they moved it at will, now pushing danger as far as possible from the civilian populations to the south. They became the architects of the buffer zone concept. Their mission was to turn southern Angola into an operational desert for the enemy. Through long-range reconnaissance patrols lasting weeks, the battalion saturated the terrain. If a SWAPO group or an MPLA column attempted to move south, they would run into a 32 Battalion ambush long before they ever caught sight of the border. Breitenbach's men operated with a terrifying degree of autonomy, hunting in silence and vanishing before the dust from the gunfire could even settle. This efficiency gave way to external operations, the darkest and most effective side of their deployment. 32 Battalion functioned as an invisible vanguard. Before SADF Oliphant tanks, or heavy artillery, from the regular army crossed the border for large-scale operations. 32 had already sanitized the area. They identified targets, cut communications, and eliminated advance patrols. In some operations, they shaped outcomes before regular units arrived, identifying targets, cutting routes, and breaking enemy momentum, while Pretoria kept its fingerprints off the paperwork. They were the fist of Pretoria, but a fist that left no fingerprints. However, the core of this shadow war was the symbiotic and complex relationship with UNITA, the guerrilla movement led by Jonas Savimbi. On paper, Savimbi was a charismatic leader, fighting for Angola's liberation by his own means. In tactical reality, 32 Battalion was the invisible backbone keeping UNITA on its feet. When FAPLA, the MPLA's army, offensives and Cuban contingents threatened to crush Savimbi's headquarters in Jamba, 32 Battalion would emerge from the brush to tip the scales. Here, the war became a theater of shadows. In some operations, 32 Battalion troops stripped identifiers and even operated in UNITA uniforms to preserve deniability. What happened at Quito Cuanavale is still argued over, but the shadow mechanics behind these operations are well documented. In critical battles, such as those at the Lomba River and Quito Cuanavale, South African officers directed the fire, and 32 Battalion troops executed the riskiest maneuvers, while the world believed it was Savimbi's guerrillas achieving such tactical feats. 32 Battalion didn't just win battles for South Africa, it bought time and prestige for an allied insurgency, operating under a flag that didn't belong to them, in a war where truth was the first casualty. They were, quite literally, a foreign legion fighting someone else's war to protect a system that, back home, didn't even consider them first-class citizens. And then came what was expected: the condemnation. As 32 Battalion's operations grew more ambitious and pushed deeper into Angolan territory, the veil of secrecy began to tear under the weight of global geopolitics. By the late 70s and early 80s, the world could no longer ignore the echoes of heavy combat in southern Angola. South Africa found itself trapped in a diplomatic swamp, where every military victory on the battlefield translated into a public relations disaster on the international stage. International condemnation was widespread and fierce, see especially across African states and at the UN, where the Security Council condemned South Africa's aggression and its use of Namibia as a springboard. In the forums of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, and the halls of the United Nations, South Africa was not merely an adversary, it was a global pariah. The apartheid regime was viewed as a moral cancer, and any state or movement that aligned itself with Pretoria was automatically infected by that toxicity. African diplomats vehemently denounced the violation of Angolan sovereignty, and UN resolutions piled up, demanding the immediate withdrawal of South African troops. In this climate, the existence of a unit like 32 Battalion Black soldiers fighting under the command of white South Africa was a secret Pretoria had to protect at all costs to avoid even more stifling sanctions. This leads us to Savimbi's dilemma. Jonas Savimbi, the leader of UNITA, found himself in an impossible position. Declassified documents and personal diaries from the era reveal a simmering frustration. UNITA desperately needed South African fire, the logistics, and the tactical backbone of 32 Battalion to survive the onslaughts of the MPLA and their Cuban allies. Without 32, UNITA would have been swept off the map. However, Savimbi knew that every time a South African officer was spotted in his camps, his legitimacy as an African liberator eroded. In the eyes of other African states that might have sympathized with his anti-Marxist cause, Pretoria's support was a deadly embrace that tarnished his image and painted him as a mere puppet of white interests. To navigate this swamp, a sophisticated strategy of ambiguity was designed. Pretoria and UNITA perfected a coordinated dance of denials and propaganda. When the MPLA presented evidence of South African incursions, Savimbi's public relations machinery would claim credit for the attacks, attributing to his guerrillas tactical feats that only a professional unit like 32 Battalion could execute. For its part, the SADF issued vague communiques, speaking only of follow-up operations against SWAPO terrorists, never admitting to an open war in support of UNITA. This ambiguity reached macabre extremes on the battlefield. And when the bodies of 32 Battalion soldiers fell in combat and were captured by the enemy, Pretoria simply remained silent. There were no repatriations, no official funerals with military honors. These soldiers, who spoke Portuguese and carried no South African identification, were presented by the MPLA as foreign mercenaries, while South Africa looked the other way to maintain plausible deniability. It was a pact of silence. 32 Battalion provided the muscle, UNITA provided the political face, and Pretoria provided the anonymity. But the cost of this narrative was steep. The truth was buried in unmarked graves across southern Angola, while in the corridors of New York and Addis Ababa, the official lie struggled desperately to hold back the tide of history. The Iron Curtain that surrounded 32 Battalion did more than just deceive the UN. It created a fog of war that, decades later, continues to make it difficult to distinguish between facts, propaganda, and myth. The highest cost of secrecy was not paid in the offices of Pretoria, but in the very identity of the men who fought in the shadows. Operating under the premise of plausible deniability meant that, for official history, many of the battalion's bloodiest battles never happened. Declassified field diaries reveal a reality that clashes head-on with the press releases of the 80s. While the South African government denied any involvement in large-scale combat, the men of 32 were fighting major engagements against mechanized FAPLA formations around the Lomba River, where T-55 tanks featured heavily in the battles. This disconnection generated a schizophrenic narrative, a unit that was the most decorated in the SADF, yet whose heroes could not be named and whose medals were presented behind closed doors. Propaganda also distorted the image of the 32 Battalion soldier. For the MPLA and its allies, they were bloodthirsty mercenaries. For the SADF, they were a useful but politically inconvenient tool. This lack of institutional recognition sowed the seeds of a human tragedy after the conflict ended. When the border war concluded and apartheid began to be dismantled, 32 Battalion became a living reminder of a past that everyone wanted to forget. In 1993, the unit was disbanded. The Angolan soldiers, who had faithfully served South Africa for nearly 2 decades, found themselves in a cruel limbo. Many were resettled in Pomfret, a remote mining town on the edge of the Kalahari Desert, where they were left to their fate by the new government and forgotten by the old one. They had fought for a flag that no longer existed, and for a cause that history had condemned. Today, the question of who truly controlled that proxy war remains open. Was it Savimbi who manipulated South Africa to maintain his relevance? Or was it Pretoria who used the men of 32 as pawns on a geopolitical chessboard? What is certain is that while generals and politicians wrote their memoirs seeking justification, the Buffalo Soldiers paid the ultimate price: anonymity in life and oblivion in peace. The fog of secrecy served its purpose, but in doing so, it buried the lessons of a conflict that bled a generation dry under the Angolan sun. The history of 32 Battalion forces us to look into the darkest corner of military strategy. the place where ethics are sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical necessity. At the end of our investigation, we are left with an image far removed from victory parades and clean textbooks. We are left with the image of a unit that won nearly every engagement on the ground, yet was erased from collective memory for political convenience. Who truly controlled this war? The answer is that no one fully did. The Shadow War took on a life of its own, fueled by secrecy and ambiguity. Pretoria believed it was buying security with the currency of plausible deniability, and Savimbi believed he was buying power with the sacrifice of men who were not his own. But the true price was paid by those soldiers who, after years of being Africa's most lethal force, ended up as citizens of nowhere. The legacy of 32 Battalion is a warning about proxy wars. It reminds us that when a state decides to fight its wars through others, the first victim is transparency, and the last is the dignity of those holding the rifle. The sands of southern Angola have covered the tracks of the Bedfords and the spent casings of the R1s. But the silence of Pomfret continues to scream an uncomfortable truth. There is no glory in a war that no one is willing to admit to. Today, as we close this file, we are left with one final reflection. In the chessboard of nations, the pieces that gain the most ground are often the first to be sacrificed when the game ends. 32 Battalion was, perhaps, Pretoria's most valuable piece, and for that very reason, the one that had to disappear fastest into the mists of history. If this analysis has helped you better understand the complexity of the conflict in southern Africa, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Was 32 Battalion a unit of forgotten heroes, or the armed wing of an indefensible regime? History, as always, has the final word. Thanks for watching Africa War Files. I'll see you in the next video.